Thank you all for coming. What I want to do is expand on some of the themes that I raised last night, looking at the relationship between these partnerships and student performance, but also changes that these partnerships enable at the district level in terms of relationships between union leaders and administrators. And I also then want to talk a little bit more about what are the implications for this effort in California and how you can help each other and what are the steps going forward. I would like this to be as much a discussion as possible, not a lecture. I just finished the semester. If you talk to my students, you don't want to hear me lecture. I'd rather have a dialogue with you. I'll present some material. Some of it I'm going to go through more quickly because we talked about some of it last night. Others I'll slow down on. And I want you to bear with me because part of understanding how to create these partnerships and what they are means that we have to understand what we're moving away from in terms of organizations and cultures. And therefore, we need to spend a little time thinking about the transition and what's the partnership transitioning from. So I'm going to try to get through this in enough time for questions and answers, but part of the getting through it means going back and covering 100 years of U.S. industrial history in about 2 minutes. So that's what we'll try to do. So I want to talk about the key principles for successful partnerships based on some research that we've done across the country. What's the link between partnerships, collaboration, and student performance? The impact on union management relations, on knowledge transfer, on the adoption of innovation. I'm going to try to argue that unions are a particular kind of organization. They are networks, and that's fundamentally different than the organizations that they're coming in response to, and some policy issues. I'm not going to spend much time here. Really, we're talking about our partnerships at the district and at the school level. I think it's a mistake to simply think that a partnership is a different relationship between the top leadership in the district. I think unless it gets into the schools, you're not really going to get the kinds of benefits that are needed for teaching and learning. And so it's really important to have a strategy that goes not only at the district level, but also into the schools and into the classrooms. And we're talking about innovation from within, as opposed to the kinds of reforms that we've experienced, which is innovation imposed on you from the outside. Okay. If you had a child graduating from high school in San Diego in 1910 and wanted to buy her a car, could you do that? Were there cars being sold in San Diego in 1910? Thoughts? Maybe, yes, no? Yes, there were. This is how they were made in 1910. Is there anything about that picture? This is actually a real car manufacturing operation. Anything about the way that car is made that strikes you as unusual or surprising? Yeah, they got a team. There are people. I don't see a whole lot of robots there, but what about the way they're making it?
They're working on it together.
They're working on it together at once, right?
Yes, it's job specific.
They're actually, those two, they're going to make the whole car. Those two, this is not an assembly line. They're making the whole car. That's an assembly line. So you've got two people, highly skilled craftspeople. They went through a 15-year apprenticeship, typically, build the entire car. They know how to do it all. They can put in the engine, the transmission, they can bang out the fenders with simple mallets, and they're making the whole car. This is actually a Ford operation doing it this way. But Ford now had a railway system connecting the entire country, and he wanted to supply cars in this workshop everywhere. He wanted to ship them to San Diego and to San Francisco and to Dallas and to Chicago and to Miami and to New York. But there was a bottleneck for Ford. Anybody want to take a guess on what the bottleneck was here? Why?
Because it was two guys working on one car.
That's right.
Demand.
But what limited how many cars he could make?
How many were sold?
Price.
It was certainly costly because you're making them one at a time, and certainly you have highly skilled labor here. 15-year apprentice, those folks had a good wage. But what's the limiting factor here on making car? Not enough skilled labor. How many people could you find that could do this? And could you wait 15 years as your demand, as you said, okay, I want to supply cars for the entire country, you still got to wait 15 years to produce this kind of skill. So he's limited, Ford's limited on being able to expand this. So he joins up with this guy. This guy may be the biggest architect of public schools. You know who he is? No. This guy's name is Fred Taylor. And he wrote a book in 1911 called The Principles of Scientific Management, which most academics believe is the most influential book on the subject of management published in the last 100 years. Frederick Taylor. How many people have read that book? No, most people have not heard of him. And in some ways, it's because he's so pervasive. It's like we're all fish and we don't see the water because we're just in it. It's all around us. But if we take a look at at what he did in 1911, it revolutionized the way we organize industry, revolutionized the way we organize every kind of organization. And he teams up with Ford in 1913 and puts in place the first assembly line operation to replace the skilled craftspeople building a car. And the principles that he designs are, you take a complicated process, in this case it was building a car, but tell me when it starts to sound familiar. And you break up a complicated process into small parts. In the case of the auto, instead of building the entire car, they did something for 55 seconds on one car, and then the next car passed by and you did the same thing. It could be putting a wheel on, it could be putting a piston in an engine. Whatever it is, your job is now a 55-second job. And Ford estimated that it used to be 80% of the people building cars were highly skilled. Now he found that he could go down to the point where 90% of his employees could be trained in 3 hours or less and have an entire career for the rest of their lives. Instead of 15 years of training, you could get 3 hours of training and be a productive automaker. But your job was simply this. You didn't do the whole thing anymore. You did your slice, and the next person did theirs. In order to make this work, Taylor had to invent a new class of employee called a supervisor, because that person had to make sure that everybody here adhered with the standards that had been set by management for that particular job. And he also famously said you need to separate management from labor, because before this, those folks building the car did it all. They did the planning, they did the execution. Now the planners are separated from the executors. Management thinks, Taylor wrote, labor does. Don't confuse the two, he said, because then you'll mess up this elaborate assembly operation, which is timed so that every job is exactly the same as every other job, and the assembly line doesn't have to start and stop. Because if I take too long, that means you're waiting, and that's non-productive. So his idea was to divide complex knowledge into simple parts, and he was the first industrial engineer who figured out how to do that by studying the best, breaking it down into, optimizing it, breaking it down into standards, and then ensuring compliance with those standards, creating narrow standards for each part, separate classes of employees between the thinkers and the doers, and invent management to make this division of labor and ensure compliance. So that's what Taylor does. Ford adopts it and becomes biggest automaker in the country, wealthiest industrialist in the world. And unions embrace this because they say, okay, you're going to do this division of labor. We're going to put that into our contracts as job classifications. So this is where job classifications come from. And so that's a way to ensure job security. If you actually go to Union Square in New York, the old Amalgamated Clothing Workers actually had a department of industrial engineering. That's what Taylor was. He invented industrial engineering. And Taylor's people trained that union on how to do this work so that they could go organize non-union apparel makers. And what they'd offer them is a way to make them more efficient using this kind of an approach in exchange for being able to unionize their members. So it was embraced by management, it was embraced by labor, and after 1918, Lenin, that would be Vladimir, not John, invites Taylor and his people to come over and help jumpstart the new Soviet Union from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. So this method becomes pervasive worldwide between management and labor, between capitalist and communist. It becomes the way we organize everything. And it runs, well, for about 60 years. From 1913, when Ford starts in assembly operations, into all kinds of industries worldwide, until we begin to hit a period of what we now know as globalization. What we hit was global competition, which meant more choice for consumers. That model of mass production doesn't do well when you can't control the marketplace. It doesn't do well in the face of the need for being responsive and to change. It lacked a focus on quality. It lacked a focus on customers. It was a manufacturer-driven system. This is what we make, take it or leave it. You don't have another choice. Ford famously said, you can have any color Model T you want as long as it's black, right? And so if you didn't have a choice, you were happy to have that car. But now that you have choice, manufacturers learned we need to be more responsive, we need to be more customer focused, we need to be more flexible. That system didn't do it well. If you recall, Taylor said, and Ford agreed, and so did General Motors, that we want the thinkers to be one class of employees and the doers to be another. They competed with Toyota, who said basically, we want everybody to be thinking. We're going to organize teams of employees, not individual jobs, but group jobs, and we're going to train people to solve problems, and we're going to encourage that, and we're going to count how many problems get solved by everybody in the workforce, not just by management. They're up to 60 per employee per year now. That's more than one a week. That's everybody. That's engineers, that's people on the assembly line, that's people in the sales rooms. So the idea is, can you get more people, can you empower more people to think about improving the organization? Can you train them to do that? Can you organize around that improvement effort? It's not simply how well you get some problems solved, it's how many problems you get solved. Are there any math teachers here? This is the slope. Right? It's the slope, right? It's how many problems you get solved. It's not simply whether you solve a couple problems really well. And so if you get the entire organization thinking about improvement, you're going to have a steeper slope in terms of improved quality. And that's what we see in companies like Toyota when compared with companies that held on to that mass production process, which undervalued knowledge and contributions from the workforce, and we need to think about ways to reintegrate the thinking and doing that Taylor and Ford separated, and that became really the way that mass production or Taylorism or scientific management, they're all the same thing, or it taught us to organize organizations. We want to increase the importance of employees' input, voice, participation, expertise. We want to focus on quality of decisions and how well those decisions get implemented, and see employees not as interchangeable parts but as professionals with a focus on group work, not individual. So why partnerships? You get higher quality decisions because you get people that are closest to them making those decisions. You get more decisions. The quantity goes up as well because you've got more resources, you've got more people thinking about improvement and identifying and solving problems, and you get better implementation. It's probably not true in any of your organizations, but where I work, if you don't get invited into the decision-making process and you don't feel ownership of that decision, if it's not a perfect decision, you may not be encouraged to step in and fix it, right? If you feel ownership of that decision, then you may come in and say, wait a second, I can help make that implementation go smoother, and so the decision is actually effective. And motivation. Carol Pateman, a political scientist, wrote about three kinds of participation. She wrote about full participation, where I'm not going to move ahead unless we get agreement, unless we get consensus. Partial participation, she said, was I'm going to ask your input even though I retain the decision-making authority. But I really will listen to you, and I really will think about ways to incorporate your ideas into the decision. And then there's pseudo, where I've already made the decision, you just don't know it yet. And I ask you to participate, but it's not going to make any difference because I've already decided. And that's really dangerous. And some people think that that's partnership because they think they're going to motivate people by asking them. But if you get discovered that you really are not interested, then you've broken trust. and it's really hard to recover from that. So we have institutions where there is a conflict of interest between unions and management, and that's called collective bargaining. And it works really well for figuring out how to divide up the pie, right? That's what we do. But what about institutions where there's an overlap of interest, like teaching quality and student achievement? What are the institutions we have in the United States for that? Correct, we don't have any. Very well done. If you were in Europe, no, if you're in Europe, any organization over 50 people has to, by law, by statute, create a works council. In Japan, it's called co-determination. We don't have those institutions. We have good institutions for where we have differences, but we don't have good institutions to work on areas of shared interest. And essentially, that's what you're inventing when you create partnerships. There are ways to work together on the areas of common interest. That doesn't mean you give up bargaining. You have both. You have to operate with both institutions. So we conducted a study, my doctoral student, John McCarthy, and I, looking at long-term partnerships to see whether there were common themes that we could discover about partnerships that had been created and lasted for more than 10 years. And so we looked at urban and rural districts, NEA and AFT, north and south, east and west, wealthy and poor districts. We looked for cultures of collaboration where common interests had been recognized and had strategies, they'd implemented strategies to focus on teaching and learning, and had created structures to support that. And we found that there were 4 themes around motivation, strategy, structure, and sustaining factors. I want to say a few words about each of those, but it was striking to us that in every district that we studied that had long-term collaboration, all 4 appeared. The first was a motivation, that there'd been a crisis that had been overcome. And in all cases, these districts had either been on strike, as we heard from ABC yesterday, or had taken a strike vote. So they had faced a crisis. I'm not at all suggesting that anybody go on strike. I'm saying there is a crisis. We recognize that there's been a crisis in public education. That's in part why we're here. We don't need to invent one. We simply need to recognize that there is a crisis, and what are we going to do about it together? These districts overcame those obstacles. They moved away from a strictly adversarial relationship, looking for opportunities to do things differently for teachers and students. I showed you this yesterday. I just want to come back to it because for me it was so striking that this list, curriculum, evaluation, peer assistance and review, mentoring, professional development, articulation, cross-disciplinary integration, scheduling, teacher orientation, coaching, teaching academies, textbook selection, instructional practice, technology, were all done together. I look at that list and I think this is typically management's job, right? These districts recognize that this was everybody's job, that management wasn't a class of employee, but it was an activity about priorities and resources that everybody had to engage in, and so these districts did this together. An infrastructure. We kept hearing, this is simply the way we do things in this district. Not necessarily because it's in the contract, but because it's in our culture. This is the way we operate. We make decisions together. And that this is done as a systems approach. It's not an add-on program with teams and collaborative structures at the district and at the school level. At the school level, we're talking about joint building teams, improvement committees, leadership teams, grade and department level teams that share decision-making, that share the task of management, and that collaborate together. Joint learning opportunities. Ray and Mary, who are here with us today, and hopefully will help answer some questions during the Q&A, or jump in if I'm getting some of this wrong. We counted 400 people from their district that had traveled together as teams across the country to learn about areas that would be helpful in their partnership, whether it's skill building or leadership development. They'd gone to universities, they'd gone to AFT's teach conferences and to the Center for School Improvement. That's a huge investment for a district that's not particularly wealthy. And they did that for 2 reasons. One is human capital, it's what we know. They wanted to get knowledge. But second was social capital, because if you travel together in a team across the country, you develop a different relationship and a different appreciation for the people that you work with. And that's really, really important. And finally, the 4th area is sustaining factors. These districts all had engaged the community. They had support from their boards. They had long-term leadership, internal labor markets. They had developed leadership from within. Superintendents in these districts largely had come from within, had been in the districts for long periods of time, understood the culture, had trust with their colleagues. There was leadership development. We heard some of that described on both the union side and on the administrative side, and plan for succession so that when somebody retired, their successor would come in and the partnership would be sustained. They also had support from their national union. So the key elements: an alignment of interests, a culture of collaboration, a strategic focus on teaching and learning. It's not simply about getting along. It's not simply about, holding hands and having better relationships. It's directed towards improved teaching and improved learning. That there were structures that kept that in place. And Ray and Mary showed yesterday that diagram of the structures in place, the formal meetings between individuals who are partners, as well as an institutional partnership between the district and the union. Extensive training and capacity building, strong leadership, the development of leadership and succession planning, and support from the school board. Tests show gaps, but don't show how to fill those gaps in knowledge. These partnerships are based on finding solutions, solving problems, seeing education as a collective, not an individual enterprise, and seeing improvement as team-based and not individual. What I'm trying to argue is that we know from lots of research that educator collaboration improves student performance. The question is, how do you get that collaboration? What are the antecedents or the catalysts? And these partnerships, we found, are a way to create collaboration at the school level. Unions are unique in this, and I'm going to try to argue here that unions are unique because they're natural networks. They create a positive climate for partnering. They foster collaboration among members. They provide democratic representation, which has an impact on trust levels. They can create infrastructures with administrators for problem solving and implementation, directing more resources to improvement, and enhancing communication and information sharing. What are the implications of this for districts and for locals? The partnership's is a vehicle, it's not an end in itself. It's a way to improve something. It's a way to improve instruction. It's a way to improve learning. Management, I said earlier, is a task, not a class of employee. And it means for the union, you've got to find ways to balance your role in representing your members with your role in engaging with management and partnerships, which means rethinking local union structures, roles, and resources, organizing members differently, and building capacities around collaboration, problem solving, decision-making, planning, implementation, and team building. We heard last night about the ABC Unified District. I'm not going to go through a lot of this. I just want to remind you, you're talking about 1,100 educators, 30 schools, 46% of the students at the time of this study qualify for reduced or free price lunch. We looked at the California Academic Performance Index, the climate survey, Ray talked about this last night, as the PAL survey, and a network analysis where we asked each educator who you communicate with on a regular basis, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly, what the subjects of communication are about, and how you do that. Is it formally? Is it informally? And here is the analysis. Each of those dots is a school at the ABC Unified School District. This shows a positive relationship between the quality of the partnership. This horizontal axis is the quality of the partnership in the school, and the vertical axis is the improvement of performance in API from 2011 to 2012. So it shows that the stronger the partnership, the greater improvement in API scores. The result is statistically significant, less than 1 chance in 100 that result is by chance, and it controls for poverty because it factors in the percent of students in each school that qualify for reduced or free price lunch. Partnerships, if you moved a school from the lowest level of partnership to the highest level, it would gain 76 points on the API scores from one year to the next. Just to put that in context, for every 1% decrease in poverty, API scores would go up a little over 2 points. Poverty, we found, was the most significant factor on predicting performance improvement. Lots of people have shown that. In the case of ABC, if ABC was on 100% reduced or free price lunch, and then you eliminated poverty there, average school scores would go up by 223 points. It's simply 100 times the 2.23 points. It's the single biggest thing you could do. Single biggest thing you could do. ABC is at 46% poverty. So if you eliminated poverty in ABC, schools would go up on the average of 101 points. And that should be done. We should do that. We should eliminate poverty. But it's been a pretty intractable problem. We get 76 points. You get 3/4 of that by creating high-level partnerships. That's my point here, that it's in the same ballpark, right? That if we could move every school to the highest level on partnership, you'd get 3/4 of what you could do if you eliminated poverty in the district. I'm not arguing we shouldn't eliminate poverty. We should do both. We should do both. But that it does say that even in high poverty schools, you can make a difference by creating this kind of partnership. What were people communicating about? We found 4 significant topics: student performance data, curriculum development, sharing instructional practice, giving or receiving mentoring. This is the difference between the highest partnership schools and the lowest partnership schools in the district on conversations about those 4 topics: performance data, mentoring, instructional practice, and curriculum. You have twice the level of communication in the high partnership schools than you have in the low partnership schools on a regular basis about those topics. The difference there is statistically significant. If you moved schools from that low level of 17, all the low-level schools, to the high, you'd get 9 points on API. If you moved them to 69%, you'd get 36 points. Here is a middle school in that district that has 69% density of communication. Every one of those lines is a communication link between an educator. The size of the node is how many links they have. So this teacher has fewer than this teacher. This is the building rep. This is the principal. These are the links they have outside the school. And this is why I call the partnership a network, because it is in fact lots of lateral communications back and forth between educators on issues of concern. And in this case, of those 4 areas: mentoring, curriculum, instructional practice, and student performance data. The partnership also changes the relationships between the principal and the building rep. I showed you this last night. It shows that in the high partnership schools in the district, 58% of principals and building reps report talking to each other on a daily basis, and another 42 on weekly. So 100% of the high partnership schools have weekly communications between the building reps and the principals. If you compare that with the low partnership schools, only 15% talk daily, 31% only talk at the monthly faculty meeting. Here is the formality. You didn't see this last night. The high partnership schools, 92% say the conversations are formal and informal. The low partnership schools, 25% report only talking in a formal meeting setting, like the faculty meeting. So what we see here is a difference in patterns of communication between the high and low partnership schools, where the high partnership schools are talking more frequently and less formally. So this is the hierarchy. This is what Taylor created. This is what Ford embraced. The idea that you have this hierarchical organization with different departments, or in this case could be different schools, with centralized control, which means if you've got an issue between 2 departments, that has to go up the chain of command to the department head for resolution, and then a solution comes back down for implementation here. Which means that not all problems get all the way up there, because people don't like to report issues. They like to feel like they can solve them themselves. Some managers think it shows weakness to reveal problems, so not every problem gets raised. And by the time it gets up here, not every problem is going to get solved, and lots of time is going to go by. This system works if you don't have to change much. If you can continue to do what you've always done, this is a very efficient system. But when you face an environment that requires change and adaptation, this system is too slow to respond. And so what you'd like is a system that had more lateral communication by the folks that actually see the problem, understand it, and can address it. And that's that middle school. That's the network. It's a lateral network that is able to identify problems, solve those problems, and implement them more efficiently. And it adds tremendous value to a system that is really designed around a hierarchy. Another school, different school in the district, and this is the same kind of pattern, but here's the principal connected to other principals, here's the building rep connected to other building reps. And what we looked at here is the diffusion of knowledge from one school to the next, the diffusion of innovation. And what we found is that teachers in schools with stronger partnerships are more likely to know about and implement innovations from other schools. And that union reps who are better connected to other union reps facilitate that knowledge transfer. So that knowledge transfer is strongest when the partnership is strong and the union reps are better connected. And that adds value to the district. So what are the findings? Formal partnerships improve performance, including in high poverty schools. Partnerships lead to more extensive collaboration between teachers. That collaboration improves performance, and that the partnerships lead to more frequent and more informal communications between union reps and principals, and that the partnerships are networks for information sharing and diffusing innovation. What are the policy implications? We need institutional support. You need institutional support. We think that these partnerships will only really thrive if they're not isolated, but that if they are connected to other districts and have strong support from the state. And that's what you're creating here in this meeting over these 2 days. We think learning networks across districts that link experienced districts with inexperienced districts is critical, that we need to find state-level resources that build capacity, that offer training, skill development, and facilitation, that you should have lots of conferences like this that help create and demonstrate approaches to improvement, provide assistance, and publicize examples. The public should be engaged in this debate, and they should be demanding partnership. I think the fact that school boards can have such an impact, as a former school board member, I mean, it's the last vestige of local democracy. If you get school boards saying, we want this for our kids, it's best for our teachers, let's have administrators who understand this, can implement this, that's a powerful message. Something that I think can really change the face of public education. And we need to engage the public in seeing the vision of what you have created and are trying to create, and seeing the value of that for their kids. And we need more research on innovation that works, and we need to share that widely. I said yesterday there are 4 states we know doing this. In addition to California, we know Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Illinois. We ought to find ways to connect them together. And in our own research, we are expanding this. We want to do 100 districts, 1,000 schools over the next year. We're looking now at teacher outcomes, turnover, transfers, whether in fact teacher retention is strongest in high partnership schools, whether that attracts more people in, whether that retains more people, and hopefully we'll have some results to share on that in the next few months. We want to know more about patterns of grade and subject level collaboration, because I gave you kind of gross numbers at the school level. I think when we actually look at subject area and at grade level, we'll find even stronger results. We want to know more about the inter-school networks and the role of unions in facilitating the adoption of innovation, and we want to see what happens in terms of your effort in California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Illinois to see what we can learn across states. I understand CSEA is about to be reauthorized, and that reauthorization will push power back to the states from the Federal Department of Education. That makes your initiative even more important in California and across the country, because as that control goes back to the states, what you do at a state level becomes even more important. So I applaud your efforts here. I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. We've got some time for Q&A, so I'll be quiet.
You mentioned in the recommendations that you recommended that we look for state-level institutions, and I'm wondering, did you find any examples of state-level institutions that have been successful in offering leadership training in labor management that we could, here in California, could look for as models?
Yeah, the other 3 states have some interesting things going on. I know that in Illinois, the Coalition for Educational Change has been around for 20 years and has been facilitating this kind of work. I think they've got a network now of about 90 districts that they work with. In New Jersey, we've got the School Boards Association, the NJEA, the AFT New Jersey, the Principals Association, and the Superintendents Association all coming together. We've been meeting over the last 2 years. We now have 13 districts that we're going to be training starting this summer. ABC has partnered with us in helping us to do that, has attended our conferences, hopefully will be involved in some of our training efforts. And so, and what's really interesting is that both the School Boards Association and the unions are offering their conventions this coming fall as opportunities to do training. So they're inviting the districts to come in during the school boards convention and 2 weeks later at the NJEA convention, and they're going to be offering space and facilitation to do this kind of training at the convention, and they're going to be having the same presentations for each other at the convention. So they're really in a leadership role, and we at Rutgers are supporting them as opposed to pulling them. In California, I think what you've created here is exactly the same kind of effort that includes all of the key stakeholders and brings them together to support local district initiatives. I think what's going to be really important is what happens next, and whether you can get the kind of resources that you need to make long-lasting change, you know, that build the skill and build the capacity, as well as kind of facilitate the conversations that are going to be necessary to create this at the district and at the school level. I think what the advantage you have over everybody else is you've got districts like ABC who have offered themselves up in their West Coast Institute each year as examples, and I think you need close models, and you have that, and so you can build on the success that you've already got close at hand.
Yeah, as a classified president, I noticed that there was a stark lack of information in your presentation about classified and how classified plays a role in the networks, and was wondering if in the future studies you're doing, if you're going to be including classified as one of the study areas to see how classified can help bring networks together. Because I know that at least in my district, classified is a lot of linkages between teachers and administrators and the public, and how we play a role in creating and maintaining these networks.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it. You know, we started. We wanted to see. We wanted to see if there's an alternative to the kinds of reform efforts that were being imposed from the outside. You know, charter schools, high stakes testing, and we wanted to see what was working across the country that came from within. And so this is where we started. But you're right. The classified piece is understudied yet. But I think we've got good examples, and if I could impose on Mary and Ray to say a little bit, because they've got a partnership that includes classified, and I think they would be the best people to speak about the benefit there. So may I impose on you two?
I'll be glad to just share a few more things that perhaps we didn't get a chance to really explain during our presentation yesterday. Our chapter president, Rebecca Michelle Macias, was talking about the fact that in the last 3 years, we have created a partnership called Partnership with Administration Labor 2, which is essentially where we have a committee that's comprised of both district and CSEA members. And as a result, we survey our members to look at what are the most important things that they felt were things that we needed to focus on in terms of their needs. And professional development was a huge part of it. Because of all the changes that are coming down from the state level, the initiatives such as Common Core state standards, SBAC assessments, technology changes, all of these things impact our classified unit members as well. They wanted to learn what's going on because they're just kind of coming along with it, but they themselves were not trained. So we provided in the last 3 years parallel training that we would have provided for teachers at the same time with our classified members as well. We're very, still in 3 years, we feel like we've got a lot more that we can do, but it's been a great start. I think from the board's perspective, there was a notion that we wanted to also increase the level of customer service to our communities, and they felt that was also very important. So in the presentation last night, yesterday, you heard that world-class customer service, and how do we provide that? What does that look like? What does that feel like at every one of our school sites? And this includes for us all of our paraeducators as well as our security folks, and of course, paraeducators.
When the partnership started, there was transparency with budgets with the teachers union, but it wasn't with classified. And so that eventually turned into, hey, we should get classified into the room. And so now all the unions meet and we have budget transparency. But that really only started about 9-10 years ago, when we have calendar dates now that we have all the unions get together and we talk about what are our issues and what do we have as common ground. And that could be calendar, it could be, you know, what kind of raises do we kind of think as a whole are available, what kind of things are happening at the school sites, and how can we work together to problem solve. So it's about, again, calendaring meetings so that you're meeting on a regular basis and you have time to visit, build relationships with, you know, presidents need to have relationships because, and commiserate, okay? And that's an important part of building that relationship, is seeing that we're really dealing with the same issues at the schools and how do we work together to do that. And so you have to understand also that having classified here is so powerful. It's the first really big conference that I've been to where there's classified in the room. And I've always found that as we empower those that are the least empowered in our district, that they become the greatest advocates for partnership because they see the value of it because they've been devalued for so long. And so I'm so happy that, you know, CSEA is here, and you're going to be the engine down the road. And just, you know, you're already moving this organization by asking the questions. And so that's great to have you here.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question related to what he shared. So when you do those meetings with the unions, you know, together, is management there as well? Yes. Okay, so it's truly everybody in the same room.
Right.
Great.
Yeah. That the presidents have lunch together, and we can talk about things that are, you know, for us to talk about, and then we have a meeting where we bring representatives and we all sit in the same room and problem solve.
Hi.
My question is, you know, we've just started collaborating over the last few years, and we keep coming out with all these great ideas. But how do you prioritize those ideas and decide which ones are important and when you're going to put them into practice? And how do you narrow down the focus, I guess, is my question.
You want to take a? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question. You can't do everything at once, and so you've got to figure out, given limited resources, what's going to have the biggest impact on teaching and learning. But I also think you've got lots of folks that could be involved, and one of the things I often see is a couple of committees working at the district level, as opposed to maximizing the idea that everybody who wants to be involved should be involved at some level, particularly at the school level. And so over time, it would seem to me that you really have an expanded set of resources that can work on lots of different problems simultaneously. And so I'm not sure whether it's a startup issue that you're talking about, or whether you've just got too few groups that are available to actually work through those issues. You what?
I think we just get too excited at the work.
Yeah. I mean, because in some ways, and this goes back to something Ray said, I think the demand for this has been stored up for a long time. People have been anxious to get a chance to work on things that are important to them. And once the opportunity is presented, the floodgates open. Right. But I think at each school, I think in some ways it's a top-down, bottom-up process. There are themes for each district in terms of what you've got to work on over the next few years, right? In the case of ABC, reading became a priority early on, right? On the other hand, you've got input from the educators in each school as to what they're passionate about, what interferes with their work. And so it's a coming together of those two. And I think about an improvement plan that could be developed for each school that lays out, this is what we got to work on over the next 12 months. You know, who wants to engage in this? What are the kinds of projects we could work on together? And then empower people who are interested to be part of it. Yeah.
This is sort of a practical answer to what Mr. Rubenstein just said. In our district, we had different issues that came out. LCAP was the first one that set the model for working together. And the model we used was to get clusters of interested people. For example, counselors started working on their issue related to LCAP. So currently, we're using the same model on coaching stipends, where we would get the coaches together, and I, as union president, would start a meeting just to do research with the people who are doing the coaching. In the meantime, the district would be getting together their people who would know the budget, would have a history of the budget, that type of thing. And we defined what the committees would look like. When I felt my committee was ready to dialogue with the district and we had enough information, then we set up a joint meeting. And then we continue to work on that issue. Then we feed that information to our bargaining team to codify it in our contract. I hope that helps.
Other? Yes.
I'm with a large school district, and I'm a board member. And, you know, I applaud the efforts in terms of the collaboration between our bargaining units and the management side of the district. How do you envision a school board? I mean, that in California, we're not full-time. We're not even part-time. Okay, so what role do we play in terms of creating three-dimensional communications, collaborative efforts, without, quote-unquote, micromanaging?
So as a former school board member, what I was told is that you're not there to manage the district, you're there to make sure it's managed well, right? And so I think it's a critical role for a school board because I think, first of all, the board's got to send the signal that this is what they want. When they hire a superintendent, when they renew a superintendent, the signal's got to be really strong. We want a superintendent that understands this work, that understands the value of collaboration and partnership, has the skills to do it and the willingness to do it. And send that signal really, really strong and support them. And so it's got to be, I think, an issue that gets taken up at board meetings. You need to publicize, the board should be publicizing to the community the benefits of this so that community members see, okay, this is part of why our students are getting a high quality education. And I think that the board needs to be part of the training. In New Jersey, the school board president of the New Jersey School Boards Association has now making this part of the training that they give to every new school board member across the state. So we got 500 districts. Hopefully every school board in the state will be trained that this is a way to have a positive impact on public education, whether it's a large district, small, whether it's urban or rural, whether it's wealthy or whether it's poor. So I did a lot of work in the auto industry prior to moving towards education, you know, more than 10 years ago. and I did a book on Saturn, which had the highest quality automaking of the entire GM system. And they used a partnership to do it. They exceeded everybody's quality. They were third in the world after Lexus and Infiniti, and they cost a third as much. No GM plant had ever come close. And yet they were a small part of the GM system. They made 500,000 cars a year. GM at the time made 10 million. So something had to change. Either GM had to become more like Saturn or Saturn had to become more like GM. And the GM board didn't understand what they had created there. There was a firewall around it. And so the board didn't give support to expanding it. It was much easier to make Saturn more like GM than to Saturnize the entire GM system. But here you have publicly elected school boards. It's a very different board system. And so for me, my hope is that if we make this public enough and that parents are demanding it, then we can be electing school boards who bring superintendents in who support this. And that's my hope about why partnerships in public education have a much better chance than they do in private sector companies like General Motors. And it's because of the role of the school boards. So I think school boards need to be educated. They need to be taking study tours and leading study tours to places like ABC and otherwise where they can talk to peers. There needs to be training of school board members, and there needs to be a direct link and signal between what a school board does and the kinds of leadership that get hired in. Great question. 1 minute. Anybody want to take the last question or the last? Yes? You have the last one.
I'd like to see more participation from the state levels of the unions invited to these meetings. I know when we go into negotiations, our labor rep she's not open to the collaboration. They want us to do traditional collective bargaining. I have members that they just focus on that. So we need a way to sell this, for lack of a better word, to our members, to our older members, and to leadership within the state union itself. So I'd like to see something perhaps geared toward those people as well.
That's, I think, a really important point. I think that what we found over many years is that often the top of the organization gets this and sees it, and that the folks that are on the ground, but that's most threatening to middle management and middle leadership, because they say their roles are going to have to change, and if I'm hired to enforce a grievance procedure in a contract, and this is asking me to have a whole different skill set, that's a threat. So I absolutely agree with you, which is why it's so important that you've got the stakeholders here that come from these organizations. There needs to be a lot of training and development. I've had lots of conversations with NEA and AFT at both the national level and at our state level, and they need to be training their leadership as well to make this happen. So that's a really, really important point. Ray, do you want to comment on that question about the change that has to take place within the union leadership structure at the state level?
Both organizations, you have to understand that they're set up in a very stable structure. They've been like that for a long time, and so I think they're aware that there need to be changes, but they're looking, both organizations, CTA and CFT, are looking at what is that going to look like, and how are they going to do it in a way that doesn't threaten everybody. And so those conversations they've started. Dean Vogel really pushed to at least get us to a point where those conversations can happen in CTA. Same with Josh. He's pushed our organization to a point where they're now looking internally at creating structures that will have communication, better communication within the unions. So then it will finally percolate down to, your field reps, who in some organizations have more power than not.
I appreciate the opportunity to be with you yesterday and today, and thank you all for coming, and those are terrific questions. Thank you very much.